Hi, I'm Charles Evans, Long Bay Symphony Music Director, back with another episode of Speaking of the Arts. You know, this is right around the corner that we have our second concert of this year, of this odd COVID season, this coming Sunday, February 21st at 4 o'clock. And of course, given the title, Going For Baroque, it's understood that this is an all-Baroque concert. So I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about Baroque music in general and the aesthetic of it, and really in essence like what to listen for and how Baroque music moves forward and the overall dynamics of it. The Baroque period is pretty generally assumed to be roughly at 1600, starting at 1600, right at the birth of opera. And we'll talk about reasons for that later. And then it closes off very generally at the death of J.S. Bach. And so these aren't really that accurate as far as exact dates of start and stop, but they're sort of symbolic. The idea of Bach's death brought with it a lot of the idea of that period being over and the young pre-classical style starting up. But as with many terms used to describe periods, the term Baroque was used as a disparaging term. There's lots of citing of that being a Portuguese word, or at least in the root of it, meaning a misshapen or odd or exaggerated. And so that was the description that was being given by some people who were opposed to the new sorts of sounds going on. But I think the whole idea of the evolution and revolution away from the music of the Renaissance was to wrest out more emotion from the music and make, through greater simplicity, really give more room for expression. So it's an odd feature of this period that there was a first and second practice. In other words, the old rules would apply in the first practice, very strict rules of counterpoint and how to deal with dissonance and so on. And then there would be the second practice where there was a lot more experimentation. And the reason that dichotomy is so interesting is that there were composers who had one foot in each, particularly with regard to many composers' sacred music. They stayed in the more traditional first practice, and then with madrigals and other secular works, they moved into more adventurous territory. So it's very interesting how this period was straddling two different types. But really the birth of this, as I was referring to a moment ago, was all about emotion. So really the birth of opera was a desire to make music more emotional and really to deliver an emotional message. And in order to do that, the founders of this operatic style had to strip away a lot of the complexity that was in the Renaissance music. And so it's interesting that what resulted really came into what we now call common practice. And that is to say that in order to create this simplicity, they had to define what was going on a little bit better. So at this point, it became a realization that there were actual chords or vertical sonorities that were sounding to support melodic ideas. Before that point, sure, the sounds were there, the chords were actually in existence in the various melodic lines coming together, but that really wasn't the thought. The thought was about the voice leading of those independent melodic lines. At this point, when they wanted to bring the music just down to just chords and an expressive melodic line, they had to define what a chord is. And so we get into what we would call common practice. We define this as a C major chord, and so on and on. This is a C minor chord in first inversion, on and on. So the essence of it was that once they identified this, the way music was put together was this idea of a bass line and a melodic line on top that was filled in by chords. And it was very much in the same manner as, say, in a jazz group. You've got the rhythm section, you've got the keyboard player who's laying down the chords. And in fact, the keyboard player would have a sheet with a bass line and the figures that told him or her what the actual chords were that they were supposed to play. So this formed the basis of all of Baroque music, is the idea of having the superiority of the outside lines filled in by chords. And then that became our standard language in music to this day. Another feature of this period was the idea of contrasts, and most simply say terraced dynamics. And that really manifested itself in two different ways. First of all, there was the idea of that being achieved by two different groups. So there was this idea of having a full group, or the ripieno, playing most of the familiar material, and then that would cut away to a smaller or soloistic group within that would play different material. So there was this idea of contrast, and you can sort of follow the train of thought. This will gradually work its way down into a solo concerto with two clearly opposing forces of the full group and a soloist in front. Another aspect of that too was heavily influenced by the musical culture in Venice with St. Mark's Cathedral right there in the square. They began to experiment a lot with antiphonal groups, having instrumental and choral groups in different corners of the church so that they would be answering back and forth. So that became a big feature of what was going on. Now, as the Baroque progressed, this idea of simplicity that was started with opera clearly got swept away. I mean, if you think of complex music, I think that Bach would be right up there in the expertness of his craft and the depth of invention and the complex textures. So basically, over time, just like happens within any period, we get back to a more complex idea after shaving away the previous complexities. We get our own complexities back. You'll see in the classical period they do the same thing. They break away from the Baroque polyphony and get to simple textures at the beginning of the classical period. But for the most part, these, even in the late Baroque, these things I'm mentioning will play a strong role. So for this program, we have actually, before we move on to that, I forgot. I wanted to mention to you this idea of continuo and terrace dynamics was played out in, shall we say, to an extent, the limitations of the instruments. Of course, the keyboard instruments of the day were the organ and the harpsichord, and there were other plucked instruments, the lute and so on, that could serve as continuo. But the piano, as I'm sure all of you know, had not yet been invented, not until we get into early 1700s with a man named Cristofori who experimented with it. But until that time, we were left with the harpsichord and the organ and other plucked instruments. And for the most part, you're limited by what stops you can pull out, what strings you can have playing at once. So I've got a harpsichord here I want to demonstrate to you, so let me just turn it over to there. So the harpsichord is a plucked instrument. There's a quill that is going to hit each of these notes, but it doesn't matter how hard or soft you push the key down, it's going to be the same dynamic. So there is this dynamic limitation, and that sort of lent itself to the idea of terrace dynamics in general, either by a larger group and a smaller group, or even in this setting. Here's the harpsichord with what you would call just the 8-foot stop, just the one set of strings. And that the quills on these relatively thin strings give a nice sort of chunky sound, like chuck, chuck, a rhythmic sound, very much like the idea of a rhythm section in a jazz or pop group. This is kind of a percussive instrument. But you can vary it. There is another set of strings, and of course more elaborate harpsichords would have even more. But this also has a 4-foot stop, which you can then create a bigger sound, which really cuts through the texture a little bit better. On the other end of things, you can take that out and add what's known as a lute stop, which essentially just muffles the extra resonance in the 8-foot strings, so you have this very light and so that can be used for very, very delicate textures. But for the most part, it's not the kind of thing you can play lightly and then, you know, put more intensity into your playing and actually get more sound. So, more on that later. Now we will resume. Now, just talking about the program itself, we have 2 concertos by, and that's in this case solo concertos by Antonio Vivaldi, the great Italian Baroque composer. And I think, as we demonstrate, we talked about complexity, but I think that his pure use of simple Baroque ideas almost launches into the classical style. In fact, his development, as well as others, but his development of the solo concerto sort of served as a model to get us into that classical style, where when we talk about a concerto, it's without a doubt a solo concerto. Now, Vivaldi was from a Venetian family. He lived in Venice, and so he was influenced by that antiphonal effect of St. Mark's Cathedral. So this kind of feeling was very much in his mind when he wrote, and he developed a style that, and that's kind of, this is the crux of what I want to discuss today, is like how do these works get generated? And I thought that the Spring from the Four Seasons, the violin concerto we will be doing of Vivaldi, would be the sort of the best indicator. The Four Seasons were, of course, part of that whole descriptive marketing angle. And that's an interesting contrast too, is that as we have gotten into the Baroque, we're talking about a consumer public that buys published music, very different from what came before. In fact, that was really brought about most at the outset by the Italian opera houses. When opera became a public spectacle, they were able to offer subscriptions for people to buy to attend the opera. So this was the start of sort of music as commerce, as opposed to being, you know, locked in the church affairs or the affairs of the court. This is actually a commodity. But the Four Seasons is a real landmark work, even for Vivaldi, and it's cited in almost every music appreciation book because attached to accompanying the music itself is a sonnet, presumably that Vivaldi wrote himself, clearly describing what the music is trying to describe. So for Spring, for the first movement, what we have is this sonnet. Spring has arrived, and happily the birds welcome it in joyful song. And the streams flow with the breath of zephyrs with sweet murmuring. Meanwhile, the sky darkens, and there is thunder and lightning. Afterwards, however, the little birds return and all sing anew. So that's the description of the entire first movement. Now, we will post that. We'll have it up on the screen so you can read the text where Vivaldi has said he wants it to fall in the music and where he's trying to describe these particular things. But it really points to this whole idea not only of emotions and trying to create a certain concept within a movement, but also the specific ideas of, in this case, birds singing or the flowing of water in a stream, and on and on. So this is all accomplished, and this is kind of the main thing I think it's important to take away. It's all accomplished by a formal procedure known as ritornello form. This idea that what we're going to hear is a very specific returning theme that you'll recognize every time it comes back, and almost always in a different key, a new couching, but it's very recognizable. So ritornello keeps returning. In the middle, in between those, and certainly for a concerto, a soloist will then have time to do more virtuosic things or explore new ideas that the full group is not going to do. So this is how in a concerto we get this alternation between the ripieno or the full group and the concertino, in this case the solo player and smaller forces. So first, to give you an idea of how this music travels from one thing to another, I wanted to just give you an idea of the kind of roving that you get, because there are chord sequences which are just standard progressions that are used throughout all music. I'm tempted to do this, but I'm sure you know the I Will Survive is one of those great examples of a sequence in a pop song. Starts over again. So that's basically a very simple sequence. Well, Vivaldi uses these, and other composers of course use these, to travel from one point to the other to get variety, so that by the time you hear the ritornello or the main theme, then you're in new territory. So for example, if I take a progression like this, this is a typical kind of roving thing. I started that little thing in G major and ended in G major, so that's not usually the purpose of such things. So what I'm going to do is take it again, and by tweaking it a bit, adding an accidental, it sort of pushes the music into a new tonal direction. So same thing here. Except here, and now I've gone to D major from G major. Another very prominent tool of Vivaldi is to use this sort of energy building chromatic line to create a sequence like this one. But now, again, I started and ended in C major, so that's not generally the purpose of these types of sequences, but rather to move us into a new territory. So I'm going to take it, for example, in starting in C and moving to E minor. Let's try. Give away the ritornello that I'm going to discuss in a minute. Which is the ritornello, of course, in the first movement of Spring. So now to discuss the ritornello, I think this clearly shows in Vivaldi's Italian simplicity, certainly much more transparent and simple than the later music of Bach and Handel. It shows more of a true, that goal of simplicity in the Baroque, but also a moving ahead to shorter repeated phrases that you're going to hear in the early classical period. So here's, everyone I'm sure knows this opening tune. And then he repeats it at a softer dynamic level. Very typical early classical idea too. And then you get the second part. And then he repeats that softly as well. So you get, as opposed to Bach, in Vivaldi you get pretty clear-cut phrase lengths and a lot of repetition on different dynamic levels. So this is what's used. Now when we reach the end, just to give you an idea of really the landmark sort of word painting traits that Vivaldi uses, we finish this And all of a sudden, the first episode where the soloist is prominent, you hear this is where the birds are chirping. And so on and so forth. So not only is the solo violinist playing, but two other violins from the orchestra accompany to create this little trio of bird chirps. And then when that's finished, you get, actually he doesn't move to another key yet, but he goes back in E major, and before you know it, you're describing in this second episode the flowing of the water in a stream. And of course with oscillating notes, that's a very typical kind of thing throughout music history to describe the flow of water. So that was the next episode, and before you know it, that moves to B major, and so on and so forth. So we had that same episode. Then following that is this very fast tremolo in the orchestra, very energetic, and lots of rapid scales going straight up to characterize thunder and lightning. So it's a wonderful example of word painting and some virtuosic playing by the soloist. And then before you know it, without even thinking about it, it's traveled, and not only to another key, but to a minor key. So we get this. So, same ritornello. At that point, we come back with another episode with the birds. So essentially, this is how really all, I hope I'm not being too broad with it, but nearly all instrumental music in the Baroque works. You have a ritornello, an idea that you've heard before and you're waiting to hear again. And then that is opposed by what would generally be called episodes, which would take you to a new tonal plane and restate the ritornello. Of course, all through those episodes, if it's a solo concerto, it's going to be creating new material, new virtuosic material that the soloist can sort of show off with. If we're in other venues, which we'll talk about in just a minute, there'll be another opportunity for different contrast. But the concerto, it certainly works well for Vivaldi, creating a ritornello idea, and the soloist shines in the episodes between the ritornello appearances. Now, the other two movements, the second movement of the Vivaldi Spring is basically about a goatherd having fallen asleep, and his dog is barking, and through every blessed measure of this piece, the dog goes. So you have this little rustling of the leaves. And so you'll hear the dog bark all the way through this movement, woof woof, amidst all these gentle oscillations in the violins. And then the sleeping goatherd is being characterized by the soloist. And on and on. So it's just a very delicate, soft movement, but really doing that tone painting of that one line. As I said, I didn't say it to you yet, but it says, and so on the pleasant flowery meadow under the rustling trees, the shepherd sleeps with his faithful dog at his side. Now the third movement, I'll just give you the line first. It's just one line. To the festive sounds of country bagpipes, nymphs and shepherds dance under the glorious spring sky. So the typical association with rustic or shepherd stuff is the bagpipe drone. And so you have this kind of thing, excuse me, in E major. Sorry. And like he did before, he repeats it. So he's describing that not only with a Siciliana dance, which is very typical if you know the Messiah just before, and there were shepherds abiding in the fields, It's a little soft Siciliana with that sort of lilting rhythm, and so that typical thing is in evidence here as well. So in addition to that landmark piece, again, because of its word painting, the association with the text, we have another Vivaldi concerto and a chance to feature an instrument that's not quite as well known as a solo instrument, and that is the bassoon. And it's interesting to then use that to note just how many concertos Vivaldi wrote and exactly why. Vivaldi, in his career in Venice, was very much associated with the music school of the Ospedale della Pietà, which is basically an orphanage, well, a music school for orphan girls and illegitimate girls. So he had a very fine orchestra that he performed with at least once a week, and so he was constantly writing material for them, writing solo material for those students, and wrote just a huge number for piccolo, for flute, for bassoon, for mandolin. I can't remember the commercial that the mandolin concerto was used on, but it was a very famous wine commercial, I believe. But he wrote close to 500 concertos. So what you'll hear is a bassoon concerto in a nice dark key of G minor, which kind of puts another sort of a sense of pathos to this idea of the Baroque emotions. So it creates a darker image. But it has that same three-movement structure with the ritornello idea. We start it with the ritornello, move away from it, go to another key, ritornello comes back. Very easy to understand the way a piece in the Baroque is generated, I think, if you know what you're listening for. The second movement, just as the second movement in the Spring Concerto was reduced, stripped away, just upper strings and solo violin, this one is just the cello and the harpsichord continuo and the solo instrument. And then we get into a lively third movement. So that's your typical formula for a concerto, is three movements, fast, slow, fast. Now, as I was mentioning, these same basic principles hold true even when you're dealing with non-concertos, not solo concertos. Some ritornello or concertato idea of different groups and so on are in all Baroque instrumental pieces, I think. And what we have, you've heard me talk about the two concertos by Vivaldi, but the two anchor pieces on this program are the very famous Water Music Suite. Actually, this is the first of three Water Music Suites by Georg Friedrich Handel. And of course, Handel was really the embodiment of the cosmopolitanism of the Baroque period. Now, Handel jokingly is known as England's greatest composer. He was born in Halle, Germany, and studied there as a kid. He was not from a musical family. He was pushed into law school and then quickly got out and decided he wanted to write music, and went to Hamburg to learn to write opera. And opera was basically Italian. Outside of course, there was a great deal of a French school of opera, but Italy really was the ruling element in opera. So after a few years, he went to Italy to study and write operas for 3 years, I think. He came back and got a position with the Elector of Hanover, Georg Ludwig, and almost immediately he was asking for leave. And so he would ask leave to go to London because one of his operas was being produced. And this became a little bit more and more of a routine. It was creating a little bit of displeasure with his employer. And it's an interesting occurrence of events that Handel asked for a leave, and he was told he better, limit this. Who knows? Maybe the 10th time. I don't know. But the elector said, "Look, you can only stay a limited amount of time." Well, he kind of never came back, and next thing you know, by the vicissitudes of the monarchy, Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, became King George I. And so Handel felt like he might be in a little bit of hot water with this change of things, and there is, I'm not sure if it's entirely true, but there's some legend that the water music suite was at first given as a conciliatory gesture by Handel to King George. There doesn't seem to have been any great fallout from his breach when Georg was the Elector of Hanover. But he did produce 3 water music suites, and the first one is the one we're doing most of, and it's a beautiful suite. I'm sure most people will know some of the movements. It features in this concertate element, as opposed to a solo concerto with a solo violin, we have, and this is an open-air piece. It actually was written as part of a water party, by the way. So there was going to be a royal water party on the Thames River. So the musicians were actually put on a barge to play alongside the king's vessel. So this literally is water music. And as would be much more natural with an outdoor environment, incorporating brass would be, you know, sure to project well. So there are 2 horns and 2 oboes and bassoon in this particular work. And it's indicative of the kind of thing that you get in general instrumental works. We talked about the concerto, how the concertate idea came down to the solo concerto, but it also made its way into these full instrumental works, and those, like these suites, both of which, you know, the Handel suite and then the Bach suite I'll talk about in a second, both of them are influenced by this idea of the dance. Orchestral suites, they sort of came out of the emergence of instrumental music in the Renaissance period, which was through dance. So they would accompany dance, but then after a while, when instrumental music gained a certain amount of independent strength and following, then they would just write instrumental suites that were largely just dance numbers, and they weren't necessarily meant to be danced to at all. They were just a sequence of dances. So if you heard our first concert on January 31st, you may remember the Holberg suite of Grieg was a neo-Baroque work, in that it was relying on the styles that we're talking about now, a suite of dances all in the same key that were just offered as a sequence of different dance styles. Now the one contrasting element of that is the overture, which is usually, we call it in a French overture style, which was borrowed from French opera, and as a peculiar sort of dotted rhythm, very much like if you think notationally about jazz, people know to swing jazz. People knew to double dot, or as opposed to da, 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 it's da, ta, 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 ta. Any of those works, even let's say the opening work movement of Messiah of Handel is a French overture. Slow, stately opening with those snappy dotted rhythms, followed by a sort of a fugal, an imitative fast movement. Well, the same thing is true in both of these works by Handel and Bach. And in that case, there's enough room, there's enough depth in the composition to feature some concertate elements. So what you have with the water music suite, at least the first suite, is a lot of feature in this opening overture of the 2 solo violins, the principal first and second violin. So they very often get an opportunity to shine, and they break out of the texture. So there's, again, this idea of the full group and the subgroup. After that, we're just dealing with a series of dances that are very simple, and that's kind of the issue with this. Most of these dances are very simple, 2-part binary affairs. So where you'll get the dance tune at the beginning, and that's usually, that first section will be repeated, and it will venture from the opening key to a related key, usually going from, say, G major to D major. Then you get to the second part, the same material is going to be presented, but now going from D major back to G. So it's a very, very simple formula, and both of those sections are repeated. So for example, in the Water Music Suite number 1, we go, well, there are some that are not necessarily dance related. The opening movement is the overture. Then we go to a slow expressive thing featuring an oboe solo. So that's another sort of concertino element to it. Then we go to an allegro that's sort of like a hornpipe. Then an andante, and then of course the obligatory minuet, which in this case opens with the 2 horns stating the main tune. So it's a very effective sort of outdoor kind of thing. They get a chance to say the entire melody, and then the orchestra joins in on the rest of the minuet. There are other movements, but those are the ones we are going to be doing for that first suite, because it's the first suite in particular is rather extensive. Now, as we look into the Bach orchestral suite, I think it's just interesting when you look at Bach. They both were born in the same year, and they both represent the pinnacle of the sort of German Baroque, late Baroque style. Very complex, with lots of textural variety and so on. But whereas Handel was completely cosmopolitan, was German, went to Italy to study, spent most of his life in England, in London, Bach was a German and never ventured very far from his birthplace. He worked generally in that area and was not very highly regarded as a composer in his day. It took quite a bit of time for him to be discovered. And many of you out there may know that Felix Mendelssohn brought out some of Bach's choral music, the St. Matthew Passion, I believe, and sort of had a reawakening for Bach. Nowadays, Bach is revered as the absolute, just the top of musical craft. And it's really amazing what he was able to craft in music, and with fugues and so on and so forth. But it's interesting also that he wasn't regarded. I guess it was more complicated than people were willing to deal with at the time. But this particular suite, it's called the first suite in C major. They're really not a clear sequence. It just happens to be labeled that. It's believed to be the earliest one, and it was probably written during his period where he was not so much involved being employed with church music. But he was rather working for the Prince at Cöthen, and he was free to write a lot of instrumental music. And this is the period when the Brandenburg concertos were written. So this has that same idea that you hear in the Handel. In fact, Bach's name for these suites were overtures, because the overture occupied such an important place in the whole suite. So the overture here is by far the most extensive piece. It starts off with a slow, sort of celebratory, stately rhythm, very much in the French overture style, and then goes right to an allegro, which features a lot of concertante elements, in this case with the 2 oboes and the bassoon. They take a lot of solo time, and that creates the contrast. Beyond that, it's mostly French dances of that simple two-part nature that I had mentioned just a moment ago. And we have a courante, a French sort of animated running dance, Northern Italian dance of Forlane. We have, of course, the obligatory minuet, and then we end with a very lively bourrée. So with the 2 concertos by Vivaldi, the 2 orchestral suites, one by Handel, the Water Music Suite, and the Bach Orchestral Suite, I think we sort of make a survey of the 3 great composers of the late Baroque period. So I think you'll enjoy the contrast and that overall sense of the logic of hearing a main idea and then wandering away, this ritornello idea that sort of permeates the entire logic of this music. So just as a reminder, this concert, Going For Baroque, is Sunday, February 21st at 4 o'clock, and we are only live streamed like we were for the first. We'll see how conditions develop as we get into March, but right now it's only live streamed. To get a ticket, you simply get on the longbaysymphony.com website, or you can look on the Long Bay Symphony's Facebook page, and you can order and get a ticket, $15. It's a steal, and you get a code, and you can get, join the performance online. Now, the nice thing about this is that for $15, you can have as many people as you want or feel safe having together. I do want to mention, before I forget, we will be joined in this particular concert by a select group of the Youth Symphony members. We have a lot of outstanding young students, and we had established a tradition of getting them involved in some of the performances during the year. So we're very, very fortunate that we could devise a program like this. We could have some of them join us. So it'll be great to have them join us on stage for this. And also, just back to this idea of enjoying this concert, in the privacy of your own home, I want to encourage you to make your viewing more festive, to enter into a little celebration, a culinary celebration. We have entered into a partnership with Boho Boards. This is a business of Natasha Wood. She's just started this out recently, I believe, and is establishing a storefront residence at Rainbow Harbor on Kings Highway, around 50th Avenue, right around, I'm sure you guys know where that is, those of you who are in Myrtle Beach. But she has offered a special deal. She will prepare a charcuterie board for two for $20. And all you have to do to work that out is just call the office. You can make arrangements to get that ordered and picked up. So it'll be a beautiful board. She does custom-made boards for all sizes, all parties. But this will be a beautiful board of a selection of great cheeses and fruits and so on. So hope you can avail yourself of that. But if not, in any case, would love to have you tune in and join us this Sunday, February 21st, for Going For Baroque.